All right. So welcome everyone. My name is Alexis Lemma, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity to humbly offer a brief land acknowledgement before we begin our webinar today. So thank you all so much for being here with us today. I'm calling in from Treaty 6 territory and the North Saskatchewan River territory of the Otipemisiwak Métis government. These lands have been stewarded since time immemorial by the Nehio, Denisilene, Nakota Sioux, Anishinaabe, Niitsitapi, Inuit, Métis, and many others whose languages, histories, and cultures are integral to our community. More specifically, the University of Alberta currently occupies the stolen lands of the Garnu Métis River Lot and the Papatūs Cree. As we gather today to discuss assessments about climate change, a global crisis with intergenerational impacts, I want to acknowledge the deep and ongoing role that colonialism plays in driving this crisis. Extractive systems imposed through colonization have caused lasting harm to people, animals, waters, and lands across the world. At the same time, Indigenous voices have been systematically excluded from decision-making spaces, including many climate and scientific assessments, despite Indigenous peoples holding knowledge that has sustained ecosystems for millennia and tirelessly advocating for sustainable climate action. Indigenous peoples are the original stewards of these lands, and their knowledges and perspectives carry solutions and pathways for resilience that are urgently needed. Moving forward, my commitment is to act and not only to acknowledge. To me, this includes listening with care, reflecting on my own responsibilities, continuing to learn, and using my position to help create space where Indigenous perspectives meaningfully shape climate research, policy, and assessment. I also commit to knowing and implementing the 94 calls to action as created by Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission and upholding the rights of Indigenous peoples as outlined in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. I am so grateful to be here with you today, and I feel hopeful knowing that your voices, expertise, and leadership are contributing to this important work within the IPCC Special Report on Cities. Thank you very much for your time, and I'm happy to pass it off to Dr. Graham Reed from the Assembly of First Nations for some opening words.
Yeah, awesome. Miigwech for that opening, Alexis, and miigwech to everybody who have joined us. And good morning, good evening, good afternoon. It's very good to hold this space with all of you. I'm joining from unceded, unsurrendered Algonquin Anishinaabe Aki. My name is Graham Reed. My dad's side is English and Scottish, and mom's is German and Anishinaabe. My great grandfather's from a place called Okomakong, and his mother is from Thessalon. And it's a real honor to help co-organize this event with Sherry Lee Harper and of course Alexis to support our ongoing work in increasing Indigenous participation within the seventh assessment cycle, not only within the special report on cities, but also the overall seventh assessment cycle and the three working groups. AFN is one of two accredited organizations, Indigenous accredited organizations to the IPCC, following in the footsteps of the Inuit Circumpolar Council, and so take great responsibility in continuing to increase and support the role of Indigenous peoples within the IPCC science assessments, and really to create space for the ethical and equitable engagement of Indigenous peoples and their knowledge systems within the work. And so this is a continuation of the webinar series that we hosted back in April, really supporting Indigenous scholars, knowledge carriers, and Indigenous peoples to contribute meaningfully to these processes. We have a really exciting lineup of speakers today. First, we'll hear from Dr. Sherry Lee Harper, who is Vice Chair of Working Group 2 and will provide an overview of the IPCC and the process of becoming an expert review. We'll then hear from multiple Indigenous scholars and really key contributors to the role of reviewers, including Dr. Deborah McGregor, Dr. Carol Zavaleta, as well as Shireen Alwatar, all of which will help provide some color around why becoming an expert reviewer is so important for the overall rigor and transparency, as well as the overall effectiveness of the assessment processes under the IPCC. We'll then host an open questions and answers. And so for those who are tuning in, there is a function that has Q&A, and we'll invite you to contribute those questions, and we'll try to respond. And then we'll conclude our discussion with closing remarks from Dr. Ramon Peach Madrigan, who is the overall vice chair of the IPCC, and we're very honored for Ramon to be here with us. So with that, I'll say miigwech, and I'll invite Sherry Lee to come and provide an overview presentation for all of you. Miigwech.
Thank you so much, Graham, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Sherry Lee Harper. I'm calling you today from Treaty 6 territory from Edmonton, Alberta, Canada. I work at the University of Alberta, and I'm also one of the working group vice chairs. Yes, and thank you so much for joining this really important webinar about how to be an expert reviewer for the IPCC's special report on cities. It's so important for us to try and bring in Indigenous knowledges and Indigenous contributions into this report. So what I'd like to do is just share my screen here and give a short presentation to set the stage. So I wanted to first start by describing what the IPCC is. So if we look at the IPCC's official mandate, it's to really assess what we know about climate change and to be able to provide that assessment to governments so that they can make evidence-informed decisions around climate change. And if our job is to really provide the best gold standard of climate change science, that really has to include Indigenous knowledge systems. Over each IPCC report assessment cycle, there have been different contributions into international decision making. And so you see a lot of different examples on the screen here, and I'd like to highlight two. The fifth assessment report contributed to the Paris Agreement in 2015. It provided evidence and information to decision makers. And the sixth assessment report contributed to the first global stocktake at COP28, providing, again, information about climate change to decision makers to inform their negotiations. And so if we go ahead to the seventh assessment cycle, which is the cycle we're now in, we hope to continue that tradition of informing and providing information for decision makers. And so in the seventh assessment cycle, there are a number of products that IPCC is going to deliver, which you see on the screen. These includes the special report on climate change and cities, which is what we're talking about today, but also the traditional Working Group 1, Working Group 2, and Working Group 3 assessment reports. Today, we're focusing on the special report on climate change in cities, but there's also other ways that you might be interested in engaging with the IPCC process this cycle, and those include expert workshops and expert meetings. For example, in the new year, we're going to be hosting an expert workshop that it's one of the main priorities of that workshop is to provide recommendations to the IPCC on how to better engage Indigenous knowledge systems in the reports. This past September, we also had an expert meeting on gender diversity, equity, and inclusion, which also provided advice and recommendations to the IPCC on how to better include different groups of people, including Indigenous peoples. So there are many different steps before we publish the reports. 10 steps are identified on the screen here. We've already finished the scoping of the city's report, so that includes creating the annotated outline of the report. We got government agreement and support for that outline. We then asked governments and observer organizations and IPCC bureau members to make nominations for authors, lead authors, and coordinating lead authors. We then went through a selection process. And for the city's report, we're now in the stage of reviewing the first order draft. And so the city special report is a collaboration between Working Group 1, Working Group 2, and Working Group 3. And there's a really great opportunity for all of you to contribute to the special report by serving as an expert reviewer. So the special report on climate change and cities has 5 different chapters. Chapter 1 looks at the context of climate change and really frames the report. It plants the seeds that then will be sown throughout the rest of the report on climate change and cities. Chapter 2 looks at different trends, challenges, and opportunities. Chapter 3 picks that up and looks at actions and solutions that can be taken to reduce urban risks and emissions. Chapter 4 looks at how we can facilitate and accelerate positive change. And Chapter 5 looks at these different solutions by different city types and regions. But what I think is really important to note is that it doesn't matter which chapter you're looking at, Indigenous knowledges and Indigenous content is really important and vital in all of these chapters. So there's different ways to get involved and to help the IPCC do a better job of engaging with Indigenous knowledge systems. The first is to contribute to the existing literature, or that could be academic peer-reviewed literature, that can be gray literature, that can be other ways of sharing different information. The second is to serve as an author or review editor. Now we've already gone through the process of selecting authors and review editors, so that stage is done. And the third stage, which I really hope that all of you would be interested in doing, is to register as an expert reviewer and review the first order draft of the city's report. Now the second, the middle box and the last box on the right are sort of interrelated in some ways, because if you provide a lot of really helpful, valuable information in the expert review process, in the past, sometimes those reviewers who are very engaged and provide really helpful feedback sometimes get invited to be a contributing author and contribute additional text in future rounds and iterations of the report. So sometimes expert reviewers get picked up as contributing authors, or sometimes expert reviewers also suggest contributing authors that might fill an expertise gap that exists in the report. So why serve as an IPCC reviewer? First of all, I have to say that the peer review process is really, really important for the reports. I'll also say that the peer review process is incredibly rigorous for IPCC. I have to say that in my own personal experience is probably one of the most rigorous peer review processes that I've ever been a part of. For each report, there are tens of thousands of review comments that you have to address. And as an author, you have to respond to each and every single comment that's provided. And all of that is publicly available. So the process is very transparent as well. The reviews also really shape the report. So I know these days everyone is so busy and there's so many different pressing priorities and different things that are pulling us in different directions. And so sometimes when we're selecting where we're going to put our energy, we really put our energy in places where we can have impact. And I have to say that providing peer review comments for the IPCC is definitely one of those places where you can see impact. In the AR6 cycle, I was the lead author on 2 reports, and the peer review comments really shaped the report. So if you're wondering whether or not these expert reviews actually make a difference in the IPCC reports, I can confidently say, yes, they absolutely do. It's also a way to gain experience about the IPCC process. And I will say too that you don't have to review the entire report. So signing up to be an expert reviewer means that you can provide as many or as few comments as you desire or have time for. So you could read the entire report and provide detailed comments on the entire report, or you could just read one chapter, or you could read one cross-chapter box, or you could pick up a topic and just do a Control-F search and comment on that throughout. So you don't have to read the entire report. You can review as much or as little as you're interested in or have time to do. And finally, you're also recognized for your contribution as a peer reviewer. So at the end of the report cycle, when the report is published, all of the people who provided an expert review are listed in the report itself. So here's an example from the 6th assessment cycle where you can see different reviewers, expert reviewers are listed by country. So you do get recognition and credit for contributing your review. All of the peer review comments and all of the author's responses are also publicly available. So here's a screenshot from, again, this is from a past assessment cycle, but you could see that all of the peer review comments and all of the author responses are available for download. So it's a very transparent peer review process. So how do you sign up to be a reviewer? Well, there's 2 different ways you can do this. The first is to sign up as an individual reviewer. So this is where you put your own name forward, you download the report, you fill out the review form, and you submit your peer review as an individual. The second way that you can do it is to provide a group review. And in a group review, what you'll do is you'll establish a group, you submit the names of your group members to the IPCC, then you get access to the report, and then you conduct your review as a group. So you compile all your comments together, you can have discussions, come to consensus on different points that you want to make. You can brainstorm together and build off of each other's ideas, and then you submit your review as a group. Importantly, all the members of the group are still named explicitly in the appendix of the report. So all of the group members get credit for their contribution. So some important dates. The first important date is that you have to submit your registration form. So you have to register by November 30th, which is just around the corner. So please do submit your registration information before November 30th. And we'll put a link to these dates and also to the registration link in the chat. So you can click on that link on the chat and sign up to be a reviewer. Then by December 12th, you have to submit your peer review comments to the IPCC. Then the lead authors will take all of your comments, take them into consideration, make edits to the report, and respond to every single peer review comment that's been submitted. So when you do register to be a reviewer, you're going to get a form that looks like this. It's an Excel sheet that you'll be asked to fill out. This is an example from a past report. So there's a drop-down menu where you pick which chapter your comment pertains to, and then you fill out the table. So you have 1 row for each comment that you provide. Then after you're done your review, you will upload this spreadsheet into the IPCC portal where it will be compiled and shared with the authors. So thank you so much. I hope that all of you consider being a reviewer. We need your contribution and input. So now I'm really excited to turn the floor over to some of my colleagues to share their experiences about what types of reviews are helpful, what types of comments you could make, and what to look out for in the report. So if all of the panelists could join us, that would be wonderful. So we're really lucky today to have 2 Indigenous lead authors with us today, as well as Graham from Assembly of First Nations, which is an Indigenous observer organization of the IPCC, here to share their perspectives. So what I'd like to do is I'll invite each panelist to speak and reflect on what might be helpful information to share with potential reviewers. And while people are making their presentations, I would like to invite all of you to make use of the Q&A box to type out your questions or to type out your questions in the chat. And after each panelist has had an opportunity to share their thoughts and ideas, we'll turn it over to all of you and all of your questions and ask the panelists to respond. So as the panelists are presenting, please do type in the Q&A box and in the chat, and we will take your questions. So first, I'm delighted to turn it over to Dr. Carol Zavalita, lead author. Carol, would you mind introducing yourself and sharing your insights and recommendations?
Thank you very much, Sherry. Really, it is really great to be part of this webinar. Thank you very much. So my name is Carol Zabaleta Cortijo. I'm originally from Peru. My family came from a Quechua family in the northern Indians in Peru. So specifically from Huaraz. So to me, being part of this global assessment is like a dream, no? I'm coming from a community where I have to understand different disciplines, different ways of living, and especially talking about cities, because we are going to talk here about this special report on cities. So I imagine there will be many indigenous peoples and indigenous scholars and indigenous researchers of alliance of indigenous peoples who have been working in cities and having different experiences of how indigenous knowledge and indigenous having responded to climate change, especially in places that we now call urban places. And personally, Sherry, my work has been mostly in the Amazon, no? In rural places. So we can say rural places. So we talk about indigenous knowledge related with nature, how indigenous knowledge are respecting or are living in a balanced relationship with nature. But also we, in this special report on cities, we want to understand how indigenous knowledge and indigenous peoples are also living in cities. And that's very crucial because we know that climate change is affecting everywhere, every place, and cities represent like an emergent places where we need to pay attention to how we're going to respond. And personally, as a lead author, I think um, there are many indigenous peoples, hundreds of indigenous peoples, more than 4,000 different indigenous languages in the world. So only Deborah and myself are in this report, and we would like really, really um, personally to advocate for a solidarity to help us to improve the quality of the representation that we are doing in this report. Particularly in the chapter 1, for example, we are developing a cross-chapter box focused on indigenous knowledge and indigenous peoples living in cities. And that will be at least something that I would like to support and see if people, indigenous peoples and indigenous allies can help us to revise that cross-chapter box to see how if we are actually doing the things representing well the literature, because we are basing this report in literature, no, in peer review publications, but also in some great literature, and sometimes accessing the great literature that are producing by NGOs or for the municipalities or for indigenous organizations is hard to find, in a very regular databases. And also, independently of the language, now I'm speaking in English, but also you can support, for example, literature in another language. That also will be important. We can use AI to translate. I also speak Spanish, and I think language is very important. So please don't hesitate to share that type of literature. And also, the other point that I want to highlight is the participation of contributing authors. So if you feel that you have the expertise and you want to highlight something that is very important for indigenous peoples in your region, no? Because we are coming according with indigenous organizations and the United Nations, the indigenous right, we have 7 different sociocultural regions. So in your region, you find that it's important that a particular person can provide a case study or an evidence about indigenous knowledge responding to climate change or experiences climate change impacts. And please, the third point is don't hesitate to share information and experiences about indigenous knowledge and other intersectional topics like health, like education, like, for example, how you are raising food maybe in urban places. So climate change is affecting maybe, I don't know, other aspects of well-being and way of life. So please don't hesitate to focus only in indigenous knowledge, but also thinking another dimensions that indigenous knowledge can represent in the literature, in your experiences, and in your organization. So thank you, Sherry, for the space. Thank you.
Thank you so much for being here today and sharing that. Next, we have another Indigenous lead author, Dr. Deborah McGregor. Deborah, it's so wonderful for you to be able to join us today. I'd love to turn it over to you if you could introduce yourself and share some advice and try to entice potential reviewers to contribute.
It's hard to be as enticing as Carol was there. So thank you, Carol. So welcome everyone to this webinar. Glad that you're here and willing to listen to us. So Deb McGregor, right now I'm in Toronto in the Great Lakes area. I'm in Anishinaabe, so I'm still in my own territory. However, I am a research chair at the University of Calgary, and basically my focus area, my whole career has been Indigenous knowledge systems, pretty much North American based. So learning a lot through this whole assessment process about the experiences of other folks around the world. So I did have some assessment experience, and it's been quite varied. So as Sherry pointed out, this one is very they're all a little bit different. In Canada's, and then a continental one, and then IPCC. So we were given a series of prompts to help try to guide. So I did take some notes to try to be focused that I think might be helpful in terms of when you're considering being a peer reviewer, an expert reviewer, and why we actually really need would really like your assistance in strengthening Indigenous peoples' involvement and knowledge in throughout this report. So, as Sherry Lee pointed out, Carol and I are the only Indigenous lead authors, and we don't know everything there is to know about Indigenous people all around the world, even though we're trying really hard. And when we're meeting, so we've already had two lead author meetings, there's a very short period of time from when we have discussions and when we're given direction to when we actually have to write to produce the next report. So getting assistance from people in terms of perspectives that we might be missing, some gaps, whether that has to do with um, uh, geography, like maybe we're missing Nordic or Northern perspectives, or maybe we're not as good at the small island states. Like we have to try to account for all of this in some way to make sure perspectives aren't missing. So there could be through geography, and then also through what I call perspectives. Are we covering gender? Is there youth covered? Like there's different other elements that we also need to consider. And very interested in if there's like really actually anything kind of interesting going on. Like they're really into like leading edge. Maybe we don't know about it. It's not necessarily hitting the big journals like Science, but as Carol pointed out, I find the gray literature tends to be pretty good if it's coming from Indigenous people. Then we're able to represent Indigenous knowledge and experience a lot better and a lot more. It's probably not the right word to use, but authentically, rather than people who are studying Indigenous people. Like it's actually coming from the voice of Indigenous people. So the other thing I wanted to say is um, to be mindful of. Again, I was thinking about this today is because Carol is in chapter 1 and I'm in chapter 4. Um, if you're just focusing on Indigenous knowledge, probably Carol and I are going to get the 10,000 comments to deal with. However, there are other chapters where Indigenous knowledge may not be as strong. Like if you do a search, because I did this with the zero order draft. And so you want to see where Indigenous knowledge should be and may not be. And what I will say is our authors in those other chapters are keen and are supportive, but they're not necessarily Indigenous knowledge experts. Like we're in these blogs. There's like lots of acronyms to figure out when you go to these things, and where the Indigenous knowledge folks who are trying to think about this in their chapters. They say we really want to include it, but we're not experts. We don't know the literature. We don't know. So it supports them to be able to strengthen those parts of the chapter. Otherwise, Carol and I will be dealing with 10,000 comments when really a lot of it should be in other chapters. So it'll just really help people who have good intentions, but not necessarily the background knowledge. But I'm asked to write stuff that I'm not an expert in either. People are smart there and they're committed, and with the right support, we can figure it out. We don't have a lot of time, and we also don't often have a lot of space. So for me, specific comments are very helpful. We're just not going to have time to go down the rabbit hole to try to find something that's kind of vague and mentioned. The more specific, the better in terms of the example. Because the thing about learning about assessments is you're writing in an assessment type style, not a descriptive type style. It's not like writing a paper where you're trying to prove a point. So the more evidence we have to assess, the better. Like then you can have more confidence levels when you get into the assessment language. So more specific, providing us with the resources, as Carol pointed out, is actually really helpful. And again, identifying those places where we may not be, where we need to beef it up, and it's really important, maybe in your region or what you know. Your expertise is really helpful because we still have to answer the question about why Indigenous people are relevant and why Indigenous knowledge is relevant, why Indigenous rights matters. And again, it's one of those areas where you're kind of wanting to pay more attention to it in other chapters. Maybe it's just me imposing my will on you, but so for example, if I'm talking about Indigenous rights in chapter 4, how do we accelerate climate change? If it's not mentioned in chapter 3, where the solutions are, it looks kind of weird. So you want to have like a logic and a consistent narrative that's going through the report. Now I can have a conversation with Carol and say, this is what I wrote. Can we have a link? But other authors, we don't know, like you don't know who's writing each section. Okay, you can figure out which ones Carol and I wrote, but for most of them, you're not going to really know who wrote them. So it just helps them with the support and traceability. So, and I'm happy to read what people provide that's really going to strengthen, because it'll save a lot of time for me to go down the rabbit hole and try to find it. Now, I will say, when we get briefed, systematic reviews are privileged even among all the peer reviews because they're looking at a massive amount of literature. But again, there's an interest in the gray literature, which I find very useful. We haven't figured out what they mean by experience yet. Carol and I had lots of discussions around that. We're like, how do we incorporate that? And Indigenous people have a lot of that. So there is an openness now to including other kinds of knowledge, and we're still trying to figure some of that out. And Sherry pointed out there'll be a workshop in February, like that's trying to work through some of this. But if you have something, share it, and then we'll try to figure it out. I am going to try to finish here. So the terminology changes depending on the region that you're in. So sometimes Indigenous knowledge is talked about in relation to local knowledge. That isn't, in North America, we don't generally do that, but in other spaces, we do. So that requires a bit of nuance and thinking around how we try to talk about Indigenous knowledge, especially in the cross-chapter box. Because we know that some people are not recognized as Indigenous, and they might be in certain geographic spaces. So even though we're very focused on Indigenous knowledge, sometimes depending on the terminology that you're using, I think we probably want to err on the side of being inclusive, but by discipline and geographic region, people write about this differently in terms of the literature that we're relying on. Group reviews, those would be great because people are dialoguing and deliberating on what kind of feedback that they want to give. At the actual meetings, that's me and Carol, and maybe if there's a blog. So having more Indigenous people or organizations discussing this and providing really specific, good information and advice to us is really helpful, and I think very, very powerful. Now, I did want to say something about the cross-chapter box that Carol introduced. So we were, Graham will talk about how you're trying to be strategic in these processes too, is it's actually very short. So if nothing else, look at that one. And we did that strategically because we wanted people's input. We wanted to know what people think. We wanted to know, what are we missing? What are we covering? Is this part good? Like that was very deliberate and thoughtful so that we could get good expert review comments and remarks and resources to help strengthen that section. So don't be alarmed, like, why is this so short? It was done on purpose because we really, as an expert reviewer, we actually want your input. Yeah, I think that's what I'll say about that, other than case examples are very helpful, because right now we're getting to the more detail-y part of things where you're trying to assess, and when you make kind of a global statement, such and such and such Indigenous rights are important, self-determination is important to accelerate climate change. People say, could you give an example of that? So examples are very helpful to strengthen the evidence that we're able to that hopefully we're able to provide. So I just had a couple comments for considerations. This is why you had to go first, Carol. Again, Carol and I probably aren't going to have the capacity to deal with all comments related to Indigenous. So it is important to comment on what you're seeing or not seeing in other chapters. And Carol and I will be there at the third meeting anyway, and I think hopefully there'll be a blog and I don't know, Sherry, if you're going to be there, but we'll be able to hopefully help some of the others. Talk about and deal with review comments. So I will stop there. So thank you for listening, and hopefully there was some gems in there, maybe some inspiration for why we really need you to be part of this process.
Amazing. Thanks so much, Deb. Lots of gems in there for sure. Now I get to turn it over to Dr. Graham Reid. I'm really looking forward to hearing your comments, Graham, on any number of issues, including the importance of getting more Indigenous inclusion and Indigenous knowledge systems included in a report like the IPCC and the places that IPCC needs to go. Graham, over to you.
Yeah, miigwech, Sherry, and really miigwech to both Deb and Carol for setting the scene and for sharing really practical recommendations on what is required from the perspective of an author. I guess like one just broad reflection is, so we've heard from the two Indigenous lead authors in the entirety of the special report. And for me, that just signals that like anything, there's an absence of specific expertise to engage ethically with Indigenous peoples and their knowledge systems. And really the review process is an opportunity to introduce places and spaces where there could be more thoughtful and ethical engagement with those knowledge systems. And so it is, I think that call that you shared, Deb, in particular, which is how are these concepts being considered in other chapters, just as important as how do we, within the chapters that Carol and Deb are working on, appropriately represent the diversity of 475 million Indigenous peoples across the world. And the short answer is it can't, right? But the broad strokes is how do we create those steps to a more ethical and equitable engagement, and what are the ways in which we're leveraging these reviews and empowering Indigenous peoples, knowledge carriers, and scholars to contribute. How are we using the opportunities that Sherry presented, such as the expert meeting? And then also, how are we considering the ongoing contributions in the reviews of the broader working group chapters, as well as planting the seeds for our consideration with AR7. And I think combined, as we think thoughtfully about how to do that, we can slowly move this institution into a way in which that it's engaging with a plurality of knowledge systems in a way that it's not super well set up to do currently. And so I guess my other comment and invitation for those considering review is, first, it would be really beneficial, even if you have specific only enough time to focus on one specific cross chapter box or one specific chapter. I think all of your contributions are valuable. And I think what I would add, just based on our conversation this morning, is what's equally important is bringing, I think what you shared, Carol, just the diversity of knowledge systems, of disciplines, of intersectional positionalities and perspectives into how authors interpret certain concepts, certain issues, certain subjective truths that often come out within the climate policy and scientific literature that have been discussed in other bodies of literature, but that aren't necessarily represented within the broad strokes of what's drawn upon for this work. And so this as a practice is an exciting mechanism to increase the rigor and effectiveness of the overall process itself. And it is an opportunity to really engage deeply into specific areas. And I'll just conclude by saying, because I know we want to hear from Shireen, we got a lot of questions in the first iteration of this webinar just about, the specific consideration of Indigenous peoples and knowledge systems and their representation within different chapters. That is ultimately the objective of having expert reviewers, asking those questions of how author teams and different chapters are considering, at least to the extent that they can, the circumstances of individual or regional Indigenous peoples and groups. And, how do we encourage you to ask those questions and then encourage critical reflection from the author team itself? I guess my second and actual conclusion is a lot of what we are talking about is about institutional change. And so while we're, encouraging you to participate, we're also very cognizant that like the institution itself needs to continue using these opportunities to expand the conversation and place for these pluralities of knowledge systems to come together into conversation with one another. And the more that, we can leverage and demonstrate the response to questions like Deb shared about the relevancy of Indigenous peoples and Indigenous knowledge, the more then those who are working internally can use that to push and encourage the system itself to, open up slowly, with an engagement of diverse knowledge systems and engagement of Indigenous knowledge systems. And I think really that's that strategic approach of how do we envision these contributions over time, given the international relevancy and credibility of the IPCC as an institution. So, Gretch.
Amazing. Thanks so much, Graham. I think those are such important points for us to remember, engaging in the IPCC as an expert reviewer, peer reviewer is not only important for improving the report, but is actually also really important to help us create the space and garner momentum for institutional change that's needed within the IPCC. Fantastic. Okay, so our last panelist also provides a very important perspective from the Technical Support Unit of Working Group 2, which is the working group that's taking the lead on the special report. So Shireen Alwater, I'm really delighted to turn it over to you to hear your thoughts and perspectives, especially on group reviews. Shireen, over to you.
Yes, thank you so much, Shirley, and thank you everybody for having me here. I'm very happy to see this webinar becoming a reality. It's been in preparation for a long time. In terms of the group review, Deborah has touched upon it, but I will speak on it from the perspective of the TSU. So as you said, Shirley, people can apply on the platform to be individual reviewers, and that is what applies to everybody, regardless whether they will be part of a group review or they will review the report on their own individually in their own time. When we say group review, we usually mean that a group of experts, preferably under the same organization or sharing the same expertise theme. So all of them are finance experts, all of them are Indigenous knowledge practitioners or researchers, all of them are legal experts, and they gather each other and they sort of have an open discussion after they have registered as reviewers, of course, and after they have signed the confidentiality agreement that they find in the platform. They have this open discussion together as to how they what does the report look like. They can pick, as you said, Shirley, as a reviewer, you do not need to go through the whole report. You can decide to focus on one chapter or on a certain section. So you do not need to go through the whole report. However, the group typically looks at the outline of the report that has been published and is available on the IPCC website. They check what each chapter is supposed to be covering with the outlines, and they identify their chapters or sections of interest. They go into the report, they look at the parts that are interesting to them, and they discuss it just like we're doing now. I have seen multiple group reviews take place in the last weeks because this is a high priority activity for us as a TSU. So I've been coordinating group reviews on finance, youth, law. And when I say that, it means that people that are experts in that field have looked at the report from that perspective and have been writing comments from their own perspective. And so I would encourage and welcome everyone who feels potentially a bit maybe overwhelmed with reviewing the report on their own, or they enjoy getting their perspective, intrigued and challenged in a group setting. And you can create these group reviews. What you do is just you check the report together, you discuss openly about it, you see the strength points of the report, you see the weak points of the report, and you write it into the form of comments. In the end, the recognition is the same. Your name is still written as a reviewer when the report is published, and your comments will be also published publicly at the end when the report gets public. And the authors are obliged to respond to all of the comments that will be written, so all of your comments will be addressed. The benefit of a group review in comparison to an individual review is that, as I said, the group review either focuses on a specific theme or it builds on the collective expertise. The individual review is you representing your own niche expertise, which is also needed. And that is why it's important for you to know that you can take part in both. You can review the report individually on your own and submit your comments alone, but also at the same time take part in a group review that focuses, for example, on education, a theme of education, for example, and you also submit another set of comments for that. And the platform is designed in a way that it could accept multiple Excel sheets from you in case you decide to take part in multiple review processes. So that is in a nutshell what the group review is. But I would like to also remind you that it is of incredible importance to us getting the diverse knowledge systems within the IPC process at the moment. That is why on the secretariat level, we are working on an expert meeting on diverse knowledge systems that will take place in Reading in the United Kingdom in February 2026. The main purpose of this expert meeting is to check what are the challenges that are leading, to this weakness, let's say, in integrating diverse knowledge systems in the reports, in the previous reports. But also on the TSU level, we have been doing a lot of work in engaging. So this webinar is one of the ways that are materializing. But what we're hoping to do is what we share in this webinar, you can apply as well with the assessment report, the AR7, which will have a draft available maybe within a year or so. So your inclusion does not end with the special report on cities, which is now. You can still write more comments when the second order draft, which is planned to be early next year, you can check the draft then. And when we have the new report, which is the assessment report of cycle 7, you can also take part in that. And hopefully as the cycles progress, you would know your entryway as to how you can officially be part of the process. Thank you, Shirley, and over to you.
Okay, wonderful. So before I offer a couple of comments myself and then turn it over to Shireen to facilitate a Q&A session, I just want to really invite everyone to submit their comments and questions either in the Q&A box. There's a little button at the bottom of your screen that says Q&A. Feel free to put your questions there, or you can put the questions in the chat for any or all of the panelists. The questions can be small logistical details that are very pragmatic in nature. They could be bigger philosophical questions. All questions are very, very welcome. So please do start populating the Q&A box and the chat box with your questions and comments. So I just wanted to offer two comments. One is that sometimes when we're doing peer review, we really focus on the criticisms and the gaps, and those comments are really important. So do that, but also include comments on what looks good to you. There's a very limited amount of space that we have to write these reports, and there's competition for topics. And so when you get all of these peer review comments, it'll be really helpful for Carol and Deborah to also see comments on what works and what looks really good. And so when different sections are on the chopping block, they have the ability to say, peer reviewers really appreciated this. This is an important topic. It needs to stay. So if you like a section or like a contribution, you can include positive comments, reaffirming comments, encouraging comments on sections that you really liked and really valued. So make sure to do that as well. And then I'll also say that your comments really do matter. And so in the sixth assessment cycle, I have to say from my own experience as a lead author, I really saw the report change drastically in a positive way based on peer review comments. Any positive feedback that the IPCC has received on the inclusion of Indigenous knowledge in the sixth assessment cycle, I think is really due to the dedication and leadership of the Inuit Circumpolar Council, who really pushed the IPCC in the sixth assessment cycle to do a better job. And so their comments really did help make positive improvements to the report. So again, just like an example of how these comments really do matter and they really do make a difference. So with that, I'll turn it over to Shireen to facilitate your questions. Shireen, over to you.
Thanks, Shirley. And I am, I don't know why I can't see. Oh, wait a second. The questions. There are no questions in the question and answer part, but there was a few potentially. Let's check the chat. I invite everybody, please, to write any questions you have. I do see a question by Anne-Marie Jackson, who is an Indigenous scholar and professor from, how do we say that? Teach me, please. Aotearoa,
Yeah.
Aotearoa.
Yeah.
Aotearoa, New Zealand. Director of a National Research Center, Coastal People, the Southern Skies. Could you please describe whether there are a generalized set of Indigenous principles that you are working from, that we can contribute to, that allows for our diversity, indigeneity, and at the same time our collective shared goals? Very good question. And I invite Carol and Deborah, if you would like to step in and reflect on this question, or anybody else from the panel, but maybe a view from the authors first would be worthwhile.
Carol, did you want to start from the chapter 1 perspective and then I can jump in from 4 to 4?
Yes, absolutely. Very important question. So I was in chapter 1, I was trying to, for example, talk about cultural humility, something that when we are talking about in different Indigenous or different knowledge systems in general, and actually working with Indigenous knowledge, implies that we need to acknowledge, for example, different processes of colonization across the world. Not everyone, not every country, not every region has been expecting the same level or the same way of colonization. Coming from Latin America, for example, has been very different. So in terms of how I am working in chapter 1 is more about that, no? So acknowledge the different knowledge systems, the diversity of knowledge systems across the world, talking about cultural humility, and also about Indigenous rights, obviously, because that's also very, very important for the other chapters too. Thank you.
Yes, that's a great question, Professor Jackson. So I think one of the areas, and Carol talked about this, is how do we represent? It's very tricky to do the global, but there is there's research, I think, and I think the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples helps with that in terms of what's important to Indigenous people. Not the perfect document, but very helpful. So for example, I was confronted with this too. Indigenous peoples in some nation states are recognized as having rights, as being actors, as having governments, and other ones not at all. So somehow trying to talk about what should be the role of Indigenous peoples as part of these assessments, or when you're trying to solve the big crisis that we're dealing with, recognizing that, but at the same time saying, well, what is the role of Indigenous people? So then for me, part of the challenge, and again, as Carol pointed out, it's different in the Americas. It's a bit different. That was kind of known. In other parts of the world, not so much, where Indigenous people have agency, are actors, and have rights. So those would be sort of like the bigger kind of general themes. And what that looks like is very diverse recognition of Indigenous knowledge in different places is also very different. The other thing was the other part, and Carol talked about this in terms of the principle of humility. That's sort of trying to help people think about how you actually work with Indigenous people and Indigenous knowledges. So for me, it's sort of like, what are some of those ethics? So when I'm reviewing the literature, I'm paying attention to how did they do this work? Like, what were some of the ethics and principles and concepts that they were to do this work well? So that because the big thing is also diversity of knowledges. How do you deal with that? And so how do we deal with that in a sort of ethical and appropriate way when there is such a diversity? So those are some of the areas where you're trying to have a set of principles and kind of a framework, but at the same time, it is so different. Like the degree of peoples and colonization being thousands of years, North America centuries or the Americas. So it's really trying to account for that in a respectful way, so people don't feel like they're not represented. It's probably not perfect yet, so happy also to get comments as well.
Perfect.
Nice.
Thank you so much. Graham, would you like to go
Yeah, I
ahead?
mean, I really love this question, and I really love the answer of both Carol and Deb. And I think like my like short critical answer is that currently the IPCC is ill-equipped to deal with that diversity of experiences that Indigenous peoples have. And like I don't say that in a really negative way. It's just it's exceptionally challenging to do that. And when you have the entirety of the author team represented by two Indigenous peoples, it's equally challenging to actually do that. And so I think like, the point about how do we appropriately hold space for that complexity is a key message for the IPCC, but it also I think it necessitates like a much deeper conversation as to like what are the appropriate ways in which Indigenous peoples can see themselves, Indigenous peoples in all of their diversity within these global assessments. And I think you could make that argument about, other structurally oppressed groups as well, which is to say, how are we challenging this dominant knowledge system that is often deterministic, it's often positivistic, and how are we challenging that to widen its scope and its consideration? And that starts with like what is required for authors to be positioned to engage ethically with these concepts. And like I don't think currently the IPCC really has the mechanism to train authors, right? In a Canadian context, Deb and I were a part of the first standalone climate assessment from the perspective of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. And one of the like overarching conversations that we had with the entirety of the climate assessment is like, how do we provide respectful but supportive guidance to other author teams to engage with First Nations, Inuit, and Métis knowledges? And how do we do that in a way that acknowledges that, they may not have the expertise to do so? And so what are we institutionally doing to support them to really just begin illuminating these different worldviews and creating space for those conversations, which is very challenging in an environment that doesn't have the time or capacity to support and doesn't really have the scope and engagement with just that diversity of experiences. And then to Deb's point, this then necessitates like a deeper conversation about how do we contribute that knowledge and that perspective, but then also how do we create those pebbles and that pathway to, more ethical engagement. And Shireen's just description of a group review like could be one mechanism through which that we begin to do that, recognizing that we're also talking about interfacing knowledge systems. How do we interface an oral and a written knowledge system, and a written knowledge system that is like very, very specific around peer review that we know is important, but also challenging in order to create more space for all the work that Indigenous peoples, knowledge holders, et cetera, are doing on the ground. So yeah, really, really important question.
Thank you very much for this, and it is really a really great question. There is one question we received in the question and answer part by LJ Clark. How can the IPCC's findings on the disproportionate climate-driven health risks to Indigenous communities, such as undernutrition and mental health impacts from ecosystem disruptions, inform the development of global adaptation frameworks that prioritize the integration of Indigenous knowledge systems for equitable resilience building? I'm not sure if the panelists can also see this question or not. Maybe I can start with briefly saying that it will be worthwhile. For example, in our part 1 webinar that we had earlier today, there were a lot of comments about specific topics, just like this question, targeting specific parts of information. And our piece of advice was that this is where your input comes in as a reviewer. It is very, very valuable that you would take a look at the report, the sections that you find interesting, and that you would raise these questions within the report if you feel like they are missing, or if you feel like what is being communicated in the draft is not reflected well enough, and to capture your knowledge and what you aspire to see in these comments that you would like. But that is just a reminder to everybody here that really this is where your own input is really important. But also I give the floor to the other panelists in case someone would like to step in and also elaborate more on an answer.
I can go ahead, Sherry.
Oh, no, you go ahead, Deb. I was just going to say that, yeah, Deb and Carol both would have excellent contributions to this question, given their research background and experiences. So I was actually just going to open the floor for you guys. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I look at the question, and I guess the first thing that pops into my head is like part of the tension that we deal with as authors is the policy relevance versus policy perspective. Prescription. So we can't give specific recommendations to nations states per se, because they will review this. However, I think the way to convey what's in that question is, in my brain, like if I had to answer that and think about it, I would want, again, I sound like a broken record, but I would want the evidence. So what does it look like when you do that? What does it look like? Because you can include that like as part of an assessment. This is what happens when that equity and justice component is like automatically my brain went to equity and justice, because I think that's kind of where it is in the report right now. What does it look like when you do that? What does it look like when you don't? And then evidence, right? So that it's policy relevant. So people should be able to read that and draw the conclusion that you're drawing. But we're constrained by being very specific in terms of making recommendations, even though we have findings. So for that, I would go, okay, I want to know what happens when you don't do that. What's the evidence? Bad things, not meeting the social justice, equity parts of things, or adaptation or climate resilience. What happens when it is like that? What are all the good things and goals that are being met, that are supposed to be met in terms of solutions and trends? So maybe I've been schooled too much and disciplined too much to in terms of writing and what assessment should look like, in terms of, we have this conversation, like, I don't know how many times, every time the author team meets, we're like, wow, is that policy relevant or policy prescriptive? So it's an important part of the process, but that would be kind of how I would kind of approach a question like that, but I would need the evidence to do it. Yeah, so good question. I like it. Carol?
Thank you. I just want to remark that the Indigenous people's vision about health, for example, and it is related with how in science and the university, sometimes we divided everything, no? We compartmentalize everything. And for Indigenous people, health and well-being is very well connected. So actually these two topics, the nutritional malnutrition and actually mental health and how climate change is affecting both, and both are very well connected. Based on the evidence, if you can provide those evidence, it will be more easier for us to actually say, well, we know that from experiences in rural places or experiences in these particular ecosystems, but here we also have evidence, if there is evidence, especially for indigenous organizations, and we can say, okay, so there's also evidence that actually the indigenous thinking and the diverse knowledge systems also envision health in this very well interconnected and relational way. So yeah.
And can I just add one thing? Like, I think one of the ongoing challenges of the IPCC is like really downscaling results. And in the scoping meeting for cities, which I was a part of, one of the, I think, tensions and conversations with the practitioners that were there was very much like, how do we make the overall special report applicable to the decision making and experiences that we have at a municipal or at a local level? And the like short answer is it's quite challenging, but it does speak to, and again, this is, I think, the kind of more strategic element, like how are Indigenous peoples leveraging these processes to get, language like Sherry referenced around colonization and the role of colonialism to legitimize the work that they're already doing at a national or local level. And so it's like that interplay between these international assessment processes, advocating, because these are political processes. I know there's like a tension with from the perspective of other authors, but from the perspective of an observer organization, there are ways in which that, advocating for specific considerations helps us longer term with the advocacy that we're doing at an international or national level. And so if, for instance, there are considerations that you think are really relevant around the disproportionate impacts on Indigenous peoples and their communities, that should inform adaptation related frameworks like the global goal and adaptation and the indicators that was adopted last week, like I would encourage you to contribute that as part of the expert review and really, position authors to wrestle with these things that would enable longer term the engagement of those concepts that we could work with in those global scales. So really just thinking strategically about these opportunities are really important.
I think the question in the Q&A also might be one, Graham, that you can help with.
Yeah, maybe just like briefly, like and appreciate all of these questions. If there's an Indigenous organization that is accredited in the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, it's very easy to become accredited in the IPCC. And once you're accredited in the IPCC, you're then able to participate in plenary meetings, you're able to propose authors, you're like positioned to contribute in a more active way. And so, I don't think it's only the IPCC, it's about how are we as a global Indigenous movement thinking strategically about how do we work together and build that, caucus framework that is used in other international processes to support that, and how do we leverage all of the other things that are happening, like in Aotearoa a couple of weeks ago there was the Adaptation Futures event, and we have some colleagues, Lisa Tumahai and Brett Hewson, had some get, who are working to create like an international network of adaptation, like Indigenous adaptation researchers. We have international caucuses and different UN bodies. And so I think there are a lot of ways in which that we can come together to strengthen ourselves and then interface with the IPCC. Like one of the biggest challenges that I think Indigenous peoples and Indigenous organizations navigate in engaging with these non-Indigenous processes is that the question of like legitimization is an outstanding one. And Deb being asked, well, what is the relevancy of Indigenous knowledge? Seems like a challenging place for two authors to be navigating alone. And so how do we collectively stand behind to support that advocacy within the process? And how do we also build the different sets of material and point those authors to that material to support their efforts in, really advocating internally to ensure that others understand and engage with that. And so I think we can do a lot of different ways to do that and to figure how we use these processes more strategically. And just to conclude, how we also, like, one challenge, and I think Deb, you kind of spoke about this, and Carol, you mentioned this, is like the linguistic dominance of English is deeply problematic. And the implication of that is also just that a lot of the literature that is being used in Indigenous chapters and work originates from, countries that were colonized by the English, right? Aotearoa, Canada, the US, Australia. And how do we widen that lens? How do we acknowledge the diversity of knowledge systems and Indigenous peoples that are contributing in a way through also considering what the different ways in which Indigenous peoples express their knowledge? And we have colleagues, Basang Sherpa and Rotori Chakraborty, who are working on like how to really understand what are the different sources that are being used and how to increase and widen that knowledge justice in a way that is better representative of the 470 plus million Indigenous peoples across the country.
Thank you very much for this and for all the answers. It seems like all the answers so far have been answered, as all the questions have been answered. I would invite any more questions before we wrap up the webinar. I just give a few seconds for any questions that might be written. It seems like all questions have been answered. Shirley, over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Sincere thanks to all of the panelists for sharing their insights and perspectives. And now I'm really delighted to invite Ramon Pix-Madruga to the webinar space. So Ramon, if you could join us. Ramon is the vice chair for IPCC, and he's been listening and I know this is a topic that's really important to him. He's leading this topic within the IPCC. And so, Vice Chair Ramon, we're very excited to hear from you and hear your reflections on what you've heard today and what you see as the importance of Indigenous knowledge systems within the IPCC. Vice Chair, over to you.
Thank you very much, Shirley. And first of all, I would like to acknowledge the hard work of the organizing committee for this webinar. In the preparation of this very important event. In my view, having this webinar is very helpful at this stage, considering firstly the role of this special report in the context of the whole cycle of AIR7, but also considering the importance of the review process in the different aspects, among the different aspects of the IPCC cycles. First of all, with regard to the report, very few words. Firstly, to emphasize, as has been already mentioned, that this is the only special report for this cycle. There are two more methodological reports, but this is the only special report. And even when dealing with a specific aspect, which is the relation between climate change and city, is huge, because it means adaptation, it means mitigation, it means connection with all sectors: agriculture, land use, industry, transportation, energy, buildings, I mean, almost all sectors. And this is also a direct input for the synthesis report, in addition to the connection of this special report to the three contribution by the working groups. So these are only some ideas with regard to the importance of the report as such, which is in fact very wide, very comprehensive in general. Secondly, highlighting the fact that was already mentioned by Sherlyn, the commitment by the IPCC of increasing the diversity, the inclusiveness, considering also as an important aspect this wide consideration of the different knowledge system that was already emphasized in the previous cycle, but now this is a specific contribution in that sense. I can mention at least 4 channels through which this connection can be established, through which the indigenous communities and indigenous experts can provide input to the IPCC cycle. Firstly, of course, the role of the authors and the review editors. We have here the two lead authors, and it's very important to have them in there. I fully recognize that there are extremely few, but they are there, and they are being very proactive in this process. Secondly, is the role of the workshops, the expert meeting. They provide normally reports, and those reports are input also for the assessment, are a material for consideration by the authors, and this is important. Third is what has been already mentioned, the role of the observer organization and the encouragement to try to increase the amount of indigenous organization in the whole process. And fourth is this the role in the review process. With regard to the review process, this is extremely open process, as has been mentioned by Shirley. She mentioned the main indication instructions for becoming a reviewer, and it's an open process. And also, comments are not an end in themselves. Comments are double checked by the review editor. The review editor has the responsibility to ensure and signing that all comments have been properly addressed. It doesn't mean that all comments are accepted, but it means that the comments are addressed. It could be accepted, rejected with a well-documented answer, or well, there are also comments, as have been already mentioned, which are positive comments that are noted and by the writing team. Secondly, this is a possibility for adding new literature or proposing new literature to be added in different languages. Third, to recall that these comments are published after the report is approved, has been already mentioned by Sherin from the TSU, but I would like to emphasize that because that means that the author need to take into account this in providing really well documented and good answers to these comments. And this is an opportunity for those reviewers to double check the comprehensiveness of the report, as has been already mentioned, how the different perspective has been taken care of, the different balances, the interactions that I will say that the indigenous knowledge system have a lot of learning experiences with regard to this interaction, with regard to the interaction, with regard to the different perspective, as has been mentioned, for health, for culture, for many other aspects dealing with adaptation and mitigation. So I would say that in general, taking into account both the role of this special report in the context of the cycle, and also the role of the expert reviews in the context of also the IPCC as such, I would like to repeat and to emphasize that this webinar has been extremely useful, and the presentations by all the panelists, the author, Graham, Sherin, and in general for all of them, Carol and Deborah as the authors, has been extremely fruitful in providing this information, and also offering the possibility for question and answer, for interaction, and it's an open process. We will be in contact. I will provide any kind of suggestions that are required in any stage of the process. Thank you very much.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Vice Chair Ramon. We really appreciate you being here today and joining this really important discussion. So that brings us to the end. We're going to put in the chat again the dates and the link to register. please click on that link and register to be an expert reviewer. As you've heard, I think that IPCC has come really far in terms of its interest in engaging meaningfully with Indigenous knowledge systems and with Indigenous peoples, but we still have a long way to go. However, I really think that in the 7th assessment cycle, there is this window of opportunity that has opened for us to try and make some sort of change, hopefully transformative change, but we'll see. At the very least, to plant some seeds for AR8 and continue this process of improvement and transformation. So we really hope that all of you on the call will join us in this journey and help us improve meaningful Indigenous inclusion of Indigenous knowledge systems and Indigenous peoples in the special report on cities. Thank you so much for joining us today, and take care.